All right, here we go. Okay, so I think now things should be fine with the audio. Just give people a second to join. Okay, hope everyone's doing well. Happy Sunday. I know it's morning here for me. So, of course, I've got it. Hello. Hello again. Yeah, sorry for everybody who had to rejoin. Does the audio sound better now? If somebody could just let me know, that would be great. Perfect. Okay. Yeah, so sorry about that. I really tried this time to make some improvements because this is my second ever live stream. So I thought it'd be really nice to at least connect my professional microphone. So the audio would be like spectacular, but apparently that didn't work out. So, but I do love doing these live streams. So I will be continuing to try to learn how to do this better. But hey everybody, so nice to see you in the chat. I'm from the UK, Mateus. Glad to hear the audio is good. Hey Linda, hey Nicholas, Francesca, Massimo. Oh my God, so many people. This is great. D Gervin 21. Where in the UK are you? Where's the coffee? Oh, come on, I wouldn't forget that. I wanted to wait for a few minutes so that we could all enjoy that together. Oh, it's so great. People from all over the place. I love doing this. So just as people are joining, first of all, just want to say a huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. The reason this live stream idea originally came about is because I was doing a monthly Q&A for Patreon supporters where they can ask questions, and then I do a video that's public for everybody, but primarily to answer their questions. But as my Patreon community is growing, I suddenly decided maybe a live stream would be a good format for this. And last time it was so much fun. And it's also a nice way to interact with all of you in the chat. And then I can also answer some of your questions in the chat as well. But first and foremost, thanks so much to my Patreon supporters. Love you all. All right, so it's so much fun seeing everyone in the chat. I guess we can just get started because we do have quite a few questions today. And we have some really, really nice questions. Emily, San Francisco. Hello, I'm waving in that direction right now, just across the water. Really missing San Francisco. I lived in the Mission for like 2.5 years, and thank you. Yeah. John D. Gervin 21 says I'm the Jon Snow of language learning. Yeah, I've been getting more and more comparisons to Jon Snow. Maybe one day I'll do a live stream in Jon Snow's voice. My best effort, at least. That'll be fun. So let's go to our questions. So as I said, the format is that I'm going to go through and answer all the questions that were posted on Patreon. And then in between the questions, I'll be monitoring the chat, and I'll try to also answer as many questions as I can from the chat as well. It's so cool how many countries and cities people are joining from. Okay, let's see. Pulling up the thing here. So the first question comes from Steady, who says, could you please elaborate if and how you determine your language level? Do you test yourself with language proficiency exams like HSK, or simply just subjectively determine your level by your increase of understanding, different language learning material, beginner, intermediate, advanced, books, podcasts, etc.? So, you know, it's funny because in terms of taking exams, the only proficiency exam I've ever taken is the JLPT for Japanese. So I took the N1, which is, I suppose, the equivalent of the C2 exam. And that was, to be honest, it was more of a challenge, I think. And also at the time, I did not know what my career was going to end up sort of being or playing out as. So I also thought it would be certainly a good thing to have on my resume. So I took the JLPT N1. It was really funny because I was in a room. It was a massive room, and I was the only person from like a Western country. And interestingly enough, I actually passed almost every section quite easily. So I passed the listening section, was surprisingly easy for me. I did really well on the kanji section, or like Chinese characters, everything else. But the section that I really struggled with was actually the reading section. And this is where I wish I had done a lot more extensive reading in Japanese, because I was really good at reading Chinese characters. I knew probably 3,000 Chinese characters, which is well above what you need for standard reading in Japanese. But I hadn't done very much reading, like reading complete passages or reading stories. And it's a different experience, different skill. And so I was just too slow. And on the JLPT, you have to pass every section or you fail the exam. So I failed the exam. But that's just a bit of a tangent. In terms of how I evaluate my level, it really is more about how I feel personally, right? So I evaluate that based on how comfortable I am, both expressing myself, but also understanding the language. But at this point, I've learned so many languages to so many different levels that I can kind of assess it, as I go. There's just a feeling that I develop where I know pretty much like I'm what I would consider an intermediate. So for me, assessing my level is more just, it's quite personal. It's more just a way to keep track of where I am on my journey. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope that answers your question. I'll have a quick look at the chat, see what's been going on. I'm from Germany, Canada, Turkey, Alaska, Taiwan, Kazakhstan, Austria. I love doing this. It's so much fun. Someone asked, okay, so Sil de la Fuente says, which one is your biggest, heaviest motivation for keep studying a language by yourself? It really depends on the language. I think that in terms of just broadly speaking, it's that, first of all, I just enjoy it so much. There's so much enjoyment I get from studying languages, but I have goals in each language, right? So for example, with Swedish, that's one that often comes up. Like, there's a lot of things I look forward to doing with Swedish one day in the future, such as going to Sweden, but also reading novels or enjoying movies and things. With French, I feel like there is so much more I have to live with the French language, right? There are so many books I want to read, so many things I'd like to do in French-speaking countries. I could go on and on forever. And so it keeps me motivated to study by myself, because I know that every minute I spend right now, it's going to be so worth it in the future when I have those opportunities, right? So 2020, a lot of us don't have the opportunities we usually might to do a lot of different things, but I feel like that's even more motivation to put in some amazing hours of studying right now, because it's going to benefit me so much for the rest of my life. So that's one of the reasons why I've studied languages so much earlier in my life, because I feel like then I get to use these for the rest of my life, and I love that. Really quickly, a few people asking about my accent. Where was I brought up? I was brought up in the UK in the Midlands. My accent continues to be one of the most perplexing and fascinating things about me, it seems, to so many people. So I'll have to do more conversation about that. Right, I'm going to quickly go back to the questions from Patreon. So Bailey Fulton asks, hi Bailey, maybe you've already covered this, but maybe you could talk about your first language learning experience. I'm just starting, and it's a lot to wrap my head around, getting the hang of my own studying needs and just realizing what it's all about. Thank you. Well, thanks, Bailey. Yeah, so there's a few different ways to talk about this. My first ever language learning experience, as a foreign language, of course, was learning French in secondary school in the UK. That was terrible. My teacher, one of my teachers, famously said that I would never speak a foreign language. I found it really difficult, and I felt like nobody understood my struggles, right? Like, I didn't even understand the concept of conjugating verbs, and no one really explained it to me. I was just told, you know, you're not good at languages. It's just try to get through the tests, you know, rather than actually discovering what I was confused about and explaining it. So the first time I learned a language independently was actually Spanish. And this is quite perplexing because almost everything I've done in my life, really seriously, you know, I can kind of trace the origin. Like, I remember what inspired me to do that. But languages is like the first and only thing. I have no idea why. But one day I wanted to learn Spanish, and I asked my mum if she would get me a Spanish book. I was 16 years old. And so, yeah, she went out and got me to learn Spanish in 6 weeks, you know, whatever it is. I think it was Teach Yourself that published that particular series. I could be wrong. I think it was. I remember the logo. And the funny thing is that I just noticed that, like, I could do this. And what I did was I just remembered, like, all these set phrases. I remember learning things like el hombre está corriendo, right? La mujer está comiendo. Like, just, and I realized, like, I could actually learn these phrases and repeat them, like, quite well. And I would, like, act it out. El hombre está corriendo. I would try to, like, do different accents, try to exaggerate. And then I would go to school. I was in sixth form for a brief time in the UK. And everybody was like, oh my God, you're fluent in Spanish. And so I was like, wow, this is so interesting. And then I went to the US to play basketball for a high school here. And there were a lot of Latin American students at my high school. And that was my first chance, like, being able to use foreign language skills to really connect with other people. My Spanish wasn't great at the time, but that's where I got my first taste of not just learning a language by myself, but then seeing what it was like to actually connect with another community of people. But it was very clumsy, right? So the first time I truly learned a language to a really high level of fluency was Japanese. And with Japanese, I still thought at the beginning, I'm a terrible language learner. I'm not very smart. So the only thing that I knew how to do was to just work crazy, crazy, crazy hard. And I thought, well, when it comes to sports, that's what I do, and it always works. So with Japanese, I figured if I just study like a maniac, you know, and just really brute force this, you know, surely I'll learn at least a bit faster. And maybe I can even learn as good as everybody else. But in the end, I ended up accelerating, like, far beyond the students in my classes at university. And it started to become apparent that, wow, the more I do this, the better I get at it, just like everything else. And so the more I studied Japanese, the better I got at learning Japanese. And my memory started to improve, especially my short-term memory. I just found that, like, all of my, like, cognitive abilities, they felt like they were getting better and stronger and more efficient. And yeah, I went from thinking I was kind of useless academically to people being, like, shocked at how fast I was learning Japanese. And that's really when it all started, but it wasn't easy. It took me a long time. But my first experience was very much brute force, just try every method that I can, study a ton of hours. And then over time, I started to realize now I need to learn more about how to actually learn a language more efficiently. And that's where French came in, which was sort of an experiment, and it was really cool. All right, back to the chat. Let's see. Okay, hey from Brazil, lots of people. Okay, right, I've just scrolled back up. Is it harmful or useful to study above your competency grade? I think it's useful. I think it's honestly a helpful thing every now and again to try some materials, especially like authentic materials, right? And just to see how it goes. I think the key is to go in without the expectation that it's going to be easy. But if you go in saying, all right, I'm going to pick up one of these books off my shelf, I'm going to just try and read a few pages and see what happens, right? And not be upset if it turns out this is really difficult, and come back in a few months. You know, I think it's it can be really helpful. And I also believe that if you have absolutely astoundingly deep like curiosity about something, like you really want to watch a TV show and you really want to understand it, and like maybe you have the subtitles in the language, and I would say go for it, right? Like the point is that sometimes studying things at a higher level, it really can elevate your skills. You just have to have the motivation, the curiosity, ideally the resources, and I think it can get you there. But again, the key is just know yourself. And if it is actually damaging your motivation, if it's damaging, you know, your self-confidence and self-belief, then I think it's time to come back down. A few more things. Rachel Harris asks, have I tried learning a language purely through immersion rather than also grammar explanations? No, I haven't. Personally, I enjoy grammar. And the more I learn languages, the more I personally embrace grammar and grammatical explanations. That's just me, right? I find that now, if I'm learning a new language, the fact is that if I read a grammar explanation and it's well done, it's like, boom, you know, not in all cases, but like it genuinely helps. And I have found that it takes me a lot longer to acquire those same like level of understandings, you know, just through immersion. So I think that for me, you know, even if I'm doing an immersive experience, I'm not going to just purposely avoid grammatical explanations where I think they can be helpful. So that's just me. I'll go through the chat real quick. Hello from Norway. Norway. Oh my God, I'd love to go to Norway one day. Angola, Brazil. Hey from Iraq. France. Okay, I'm gonna try and keep up with the chat, but I'm gonna go back to a Patreon question now. So Nico asks, what are your thoughts on learning languages through video games, mainly as an immersion method? Do you have any experience with this? I've been learning French, and I'm pretty lucky that there are more games with French support. Quick sip of coffee, because I just realized I haven't even tasted the coffee yet today. Okay, so actually, I do have experience with this. I'm not much of a video gamer, but to be honest, if nothing else, it's because I've just been so busy, like learning languages and other things, and I've for many years now sacrificed those kind of things. You know, like there's so many movies I want to watch, so many documentaries, TV shows, and I've basically, you know, just completely sacrificed all of that for years now. And I do want to change that. But to answer your question, when I was growing up, my favorite video game was Metal Gear Solid. And it's a Japanese video game, for those of you who don't know. And so much later on, when I was, you know, when I was getting really fluent in Japanese, I actually bought a setup, and I bought the entire Metal Gear Solid series in Japanese. And I actually, I played through, not the whole thing, but I played through the Metal Gear Solid games in Japanese for some time. And I would say it was really fun. I certainly learned a lot of words about espionage and stealth and things like this. I don't think it was the most effective use of my time, but it was fun. And it's important to do things that we enjoy. So I think it's a perfectly fine thing to do. I think it's enjoyable. It depends on your level. Certainly, you know, espionage, like stealth games where there's a ton of dialogue about like political history and references that, you know, super interesting, also super difficult. So I think it's fun. I think there are better things to do if we're purely talking about effective ways to immerse yourself. But I do think the thing about video games is that they do involve you in the story, right? In some capacity. So that feels cool. The fact that it brings you in a bit more than perhaps, you know, watching a movie where you're sort of an observer. So yeah, there we go. Hope you liked that answer. Okay, let me quickly look at the chat here. Let's see. So Constanzo Maruyo asks, how do you manage life and language learning balance? That's a hard question. The funny thing is, balancing life and language learning, for me at least, is actually not that difficult, because the thing I love about language learning, you know, one of my favorite features of language learning is it's one of the only hobbies I've ever experienced where once you get to a certain level, all of a sudden, the language learning hobby, it like makes every other hobby you have possible at the same time. Because once you get really fluent, if you like woodworking and you like studying French, well, you could suddenly start just doing all the same things with woodworking, but now it could be in French. You could watch documentaries about woodworking in French, you know. So, but yeah, for me, making language learning a part of my lifestyle has always just come very naturally once I got really deeply into it. The challenge comes, you know, balancing language learning, life, but also, you know, things like YouTube, building massive, you know, software projects, my own website, full-time job. That's where it starts to get certainly quite tricky. Because the fact is, if I spend 5 hours making a video about language learning, that's 5 hours that I would normally be studying languages. But, you know, so that's the tricky part, I think. Someone asked, so is it Mineiro? I'm not sure the pronunciation, depending on the origin. But hi, what do you think about Memrise? I like Memrise. I have to say, I haven't used it for quite a long time, but I used to use it quite a lot. And it was nice because it was a lot less work than like Anki. Anki, at the time at least, for me, was very manual, like manually typing in everything. Whereas Memrise, you know, you could start typing a word and there's a good chance that they already had it. You could just click it, it had audio. Everything was like all nicely set up. Interface is a bit nicer, but I haven't used it for quite some time. But I did enjoy it. Okay, back to the Patreon questions. So Trisha asks, and I'm sending big hugs to Trisha. Trisha has a sick rabbit today. And so she may not be joining live, but big hugs, Trisha. So she asks, can you talk about how you use grammar drills or sentence structure drills? I'm trying to create new sentences each time I learn a new grammar point and trying to get used to the noun, object, verb, sentence structure by creating sentences. Do you have any tips on how to do this? I'm using an English app called Sentence Master for starter sentences, then creating 3 more Turkish sentences for every English one. It's working great so far, especially because the sentences are split into difficulty levels. Yeah, so the thing that I like to do, and a core principle of how I learn and also how I used to teach languages, is I believe it's best to learn how to say a lot with a little bit of language, right? And when when I say a little bit of language, I mostly mean vocabulary, right? So I believe that what a lot of people do, and especially schools do this, is there's a big focus on building a massive vocabulary at the same time as learning lots of grammar. And I feel like this sort of overwhelms your brain because you haven't even had a chance to like get comfortable with the language yet. And specifically, I mean with the like grammatical fabric of the language, right? The grammatical structures and how sentences are formed. And so I feel like if the moment you try to say something, you're simultaneously like desperately searching for words and desperately trying to figure out how the sentence goes, and like it's way too much. And I think that's why people get kind of paralyzed. And so I think that what happens when you go through 5 years of school, or maybe other forms of learning, you know, you've learned thousands upon thousands upon thousands of words, and you've learned all the grammatical structures and things, and you've learned the conjugations for every single person, and like, but you can barely speak. I almost think it's like, it's paralyzing, because when you go to speak, there's so much up here, and you don't really know any of it very well. And I think it really inhibits your ability to construct language. So what I believe is it's way better to really like internalize that grammatical fabric of a language, right? And really get good at saying a lot of things with a relatively small vocabulary. So when I do, you know, sentence structure drills and grammatical drills, that's one of my principles is, you know, I find that if I say, you know, I go to the coffee shop, then just adding the word but, a single word, you know, now I can say a bunch more stuff. I go to the coffee shop, but not today. And then maybe the word like usually, like I usually go to the coffee shop, but not today, because like you find that just adding in like a few words can multiply the amount of things that you can say exponentially. It's amazing. So what I like to do is, yeah, go through these like basic drills with basic sentence patterns, but I try to keep the range of vocabulary quite small, and that helps me to really focus on weaving in that grammatical sort of fabric layer to how I know the language. And once I'm really comfortable with how to construct sentences, I find it's very easy to then add in vocab. But I like to separate those two things. And Trisha, I think it's cool that you're using that app, Sentence Master. I think if that's working, go for it. Personally, I do this by myself, and that's because I want to make sure that every sentence is meaningful to me. But if you're finding that there are plenty of sentences in that app that work, that's great. So I hope that's helpful. But I also will say, you may have noticed in my examples, I do these like in a conversational format, right? So especially when working with students, you know, I find that within a few hours, we can have a 15-minute conversation if I like build up the range of things they can say in a conversational format. Okay, back to the chat. Let's see here. Hey, Easy German, Carrie. Or is it Carrie? I assume it's Carrie. So let's see here. So somebody asked, oh gosh, right, sorry, I'm really bad at this. So we had Mohammed asks, which of the languages you speak was the most difficult to learn? I think Japanese, definitely. And part of that is because it was really the first language that I truly, really dove into and learned to a high level. But I also think at the time, you know, Japanese had a drastically different grammatical sort of, you know, structure that I had to get used to. Getting used to verbs being at the end of the sentence. And there's also so much more involved in learning Japanese. So I do think that for an English speaker, Japanese is certainly a lot more complex to really internalize and get comfortable with versus, let's say, French or Spanish, for example. But also, I had a lot less experience at the time learning languages, so that contributed. Let's see. Bruna says, "What do you do when you don't have a graded reader?" Trying to learn French by myself. There's a few things you can do. One thing is you can just take authentic texts, but choose shorter chunks, right? So instead of reading a whole book with a graded reader, maybe you can just read a simple article instead from a native source, which is going to be easier because it's a lot shorter, so there's less to work with. And then I would read that multiple times. But that's just one example. There's a lot of things you could do, but that's one quick tip. Bill is fascinated with my hybrid English accent. I hear American, British, a bit of Scottish, maybe Australian, all mixed together. Yeah, my dad is from Scotland, and I do have a few features that I picked up from him. And I also use certain words. So I very frequently use like a wee bit, or like, for example, let's have a wee chat. I love it. I find it so endearing and nice, and I chose to make that a part of how I speak the English language. So yeah, definitely a mix. Let's see. Okay, let's go back to Patreon. Once we get through all the Patreon questions, I'll try to come back and do a lot more of the chat questions as well. I hope you're all having a good time. I'm enjoying this. Cheers. Okay, let's see. Monica asks, "Hi, wondering if you could relate playing the piano to language learning. I happened to see a keyboard in one of your videos in the past. Do you find it addicting, or do you get into a flow state with playing music? If so, is this a similar experience when learning languages for you? And could you elaborate? Side note, I recently acquired a piano and I'm playing very simple classical and folk pieces, and I find this highly addictive. Hope it somehow enhances language learning." It's actually funny you say this. First of all, as some of you may know, I'm really interested in doing more videos that are heavily based on scientific research. I did a whole series about sleep, and that was really fascinating. And I have a lot of other videos lined up, such as how coffee impacts language learning. And that's going to be a fun one, reading a ton of research papers about studies that have been done into the impact that coffee has on our body and on our ability to learn. So I say all that because I have so many of these interesting ideas, and I think this would be a great candidate for a video. At the moment, I'm struggling a bit because those videos take so much preparation. But once I can go full time on language learning based content creation projects, then I'll do more of those. To answer the question though, just the other day, I was actually watching a video and then I read an article afterwards about how when you play music, it's like a cognitive fireworks show. Like it really has a fascinating impact on your brain's cognitive activity, and there's a lot to be said for the sort of benefits to your brain when it comes to playing music. So I would love to do a cool video exploring how playing a musical instrument could positively impact your language learning. But the short answer is I think it does in that regard. Anything that's good for your your brain and your ability to learn new things is positive. Yeah, I've been playing instruments for a long time, but funnily enough, I can't read music because I've always done everything by ear, and it's kind of a funny thing. But yeah, I do get into a flow state playing music, and it is a bit similar to learning languages. I think that playing music in a way feels a bit like speaking a language. When you first start playing something, you're kind of shaky, and it doesn't feel good at first, right? Because it's so difficult. But once you really learn a song very well, or once you just get extremely good at playing that instrument, then you feel this level of mastery and control over what you're able to produce. And personally, I do a lot of improvisation, where I just play songs, either piano or guitar, and I just make it up. And that feels a lot like speaking a language, where once you get really good, it feels great, you know, because there's this level of control and mastery. And, you know, everything you say, there are less and less mistakes. Just like on a piano, you make less and less mistakes. So yeah. Let's see. Maria asks, how many languages do you speak? I'm starting to have a hard time knowing how to answer this, but I typically say 8, including English, so 7 foreign languages. Mandarin Chinese, you know, I did post my very first real conversation in Chinese on this channel, but I don't feel comfortable saying I speak Chinese yet, but I think in the near future that might be added to the list. Let's see. Okay, I'll go back to Patreon, but like I said, I'll try to make time for lots more chat questions afterwards. Nicholas says, hello, Robin. If you get the chance, I'd like to know about the job you were offered in Finland. You don't need to speak about your experience if you aren't comfortable with that, but just how you got that job and what was it? Do you have plans to return? I would love to live and work in Finland myself one day. Thanks as always. I hope the Spanish is going well. Yeah, so that was an interesting story. I went, so there was a period of my life where I didn't know how to use language learning in my career. And I was having a really difficult time like getting a job that was outside the realm of customer service. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with working customer service. I felt like I wanted to do things that used the skills that I had better, right? But I was having a terrible time. It was so difficult. And so I tried a bunch of different things. And at one point I got kind of involved in public relations. And I actually worked as an international public relations writer for a fashion startup in Germany at one point. So that's how I ended up living in Hamburg, Germany for a short time. But yeah, so while I was at the Polyglot conference in Serbia in 2014, I ended up, by complete coincidence, sharing a taxi with a guy named Claudio Santori Spadini. And Claudio was the CEO of, God, what was it actually called now? It was a company based in Lithuania. I'm having a hard time, actually. Does anyone in the chat remember? Does anyone know Claudio? Let me see. What was the name of his company? Oh, I can't remember what it was called now, because the company is no longer around, I think. But long story short, he ended up leaving that company. He was an entrepreneur. He worked at a bunch of companies, and he got a job for a company. I'm not sure I should say the name of the company or not, but it was a company based in Helsinki, and they were doing stuff related to social media. And it was a startup that was doing really well. So yes, Blue. Thank you. Yes, it was called Blue. That was Claudio's company. Yeah, so we stayed in touch, and we became quite good friends. And he was really supportive, and he liked my work ethic. And I think he saw me struggling a lot to advance my career. And so at a certain point, you know, I was looking for work in French. I felt like my French at the time was at a really, really high level where I could do a lot of professional work in French. I'd already worked as a French customer service representative. I had done a bunch of stuff. So yeah, Claudio introduced me to to someone that was really high up in the French sort of like, public relations or whatever department of this company. And I started going through the interview process. And I love Finland. I love Helsinki, One of my best friends is from Helsinki and still lives there. I considered doing a master's degree in Helsinki at one point. So it was really cool to get the chance, but that ended up being at probably the most difficult time in my entire life emotionally. And I've been through some crazy stuff, but that was sort of the absolute pinnacle. And it ended up just like completely tearing me down. And I remember I went into the office. I was just going through the final stages of the whole interview process. And I just had like a breakdown. So I held it together. But then afterwards, I was in a coffee shop talking to the owner, a guy I met called John. And I was like in tears. I was just having such a hard time. And so I ended up leaving Helsinki and not going further with the job. And that was the end of that. And yeah. Okay, let's see. Back to the chat. Let's see. Okay. Trying to scroll up. Oh gosh. Okay. Sorry, it's kind of boring when I'm just scrolling up. Levi or Levi asks, if you had to design the perfect language learning app, how would you do it? It really depends on what the purpose is. So I've tried my best to design the perfect language learning journaling application, right, with Journaly. And I went through a massive, long design process with Journaly. And it's never ending, right? But I spent months studying UX design, UI design, studying interaction design, studying information architecture, so many different things. I did things like empathy maps, a mood board, just like user personas, so many things. But the way I design Journaly would be very different than designing a core like language learning application. And I do think I will do that one day. I think one day I will design my own. I'm going to be building a lot more stuff for the language learning community. So we'll see how that goes. One more question from the chat, because I'm getting a bit behind on it. So Nya asks, how would you get over the fear of speaking, or Naya, sorry, I'm not sure the correct pronunciation. And how do you sound more authentic when it comes to the language you're learning? Yeah, so honestly, the way I get over the fear of speaking is practicing a lot. And as many of you know, I practice a lot by myself. So at the end of the day, I'm constantly repeating things out loud. I'm constantly producing language, even if that means just simply copying things, right? So what that does is it means that when I do go to speak to somebody, it's not the first time. I find that many people, when learning a language, they barely open their mouth. And so, of course, when they go to try to speak to somebody, they're incredibly nervous because they don't have much experience even just producing that language, producing the sounds. So that's one thing, is that I make sure I constantly repeat things out loud. I'm always using my mouth. So at the very least, I'm comfortable making the sounds of the language. And then, like I say, I practice a lot of sentence drills and things. I want to make sure that I have a basic, comfort with simple sentences. So at the very least, I'll be able to say some things. And then when it comes to sounding more authentic, again, I'm constantly practicing, right? So I remember with the French R sound, like merci, this R, it took me forever, right? But at the same time, well, actually, it was quite quick, but it took thousands and thousands and thousands of repetitions. And I remember when I used to get stuck and trip over my tongue, but every single time I would repeat a sentence from my language learning app, I think what was I using at the time? I used a bunch of stuff, but every time I'd get a little bit better. And so that helped me. But I also do things like, as I get more advanced, I pick a certain person and I'll try to really emulate the way they speak, and I'll try to focus on copying them, their mannerisms and certain things. Yeah, let's see. Jamie Green says, I'm from the Midlands, Oxford, and I've never heard your accent. Yeah, I'm currently in the process of transforming my accent a bit. It's a really, really bizarre thing to talk about. I don't know the best way to express it, but I'm currently in the process of adjusting and tweaking certain features of my accent. And so it's starting to get a bit more consistent, but that might be why it's very confusing. Okay, back to the Patreon questions. Let's see. So Kristen asks, could you go into more detail about how you actually prepare your podcast interviews that you do to practice your conversation skills? Do you pick a topic, then need to actually look up the dialogue that you want to practice and write it down, or do you know enough to just do a conversation? I think that would take me quite a bit of research to really come up with something interesting to talk about that stretches my skills and that I'm sure is correct. Could you do a demo of one of your conversations? Thanks for all that you do. Oh, demo. I know last live stream I did a live demo of shadowing. So first I will say that, so I listen to a lot of podcasts, right? So I'm very familiar with the format of an interview and, you know, maybe the particular type of thing. So in French, I used to listen to a ton of interviews on the podcast Laissez-vous tenter, which I used to just love. And they would do these wonderful interviews between, you know, like a director who had a new movie coming out and then someone else. There were these lovely interviews that I loved. I think the guy's name was Bernard Lou. And he was a book fanatic and he would interview authors of famous books. And there was a separate podcast called Chemin d'écrivain that was specifically just these 15-minute interviews with famous authors. So I try to emulate that format and that style when I do my podcast interview method. So, and I remember specifically, I actually have recordings on my phone somewhere of I used to record myself pretending that one day I was an author and I was being interviewed on that podcast, right? So that's one thing. Now, again, I talk about things that I have a lot to say about. So, you know, there's a bunch of things I'm really interested in, let's say design, or let's say specifically application design, right? And maybe even more specifically, user experience design. That's a topic I have so much to talk about. And so by choosing that, I could go very broad or I could go very deep. The point is that I know what things I have a lot to say about. So I try to make sure I ask a question about those things. And then I'm constantly referencing my sentence bank to try to at least get the correct grammatical structure for my answers. And I never create a script, but I do. I do spend some time looking up key vocabulary words around that subject. So, for example, in Mandarin Chinese, I'd have a hard time. You know, I don't know any words really. I think it's 设计, I think is the word for design. So, you know, but I'd have to spend some time looking up all the key vocabulary. But yeah, other than that, I don't worry too much about things being a bit wrong, right? I think a lot of people have this phobia of making mistakes, and they're so worried that they're going to permanently, you know, internalize grammatical mistakes or things like that. I've never worried about that because I have personally found, and it's not just me, I've done this with so many students in the past, the better I get in a language, for me, the easier it is to fix those mistakes, right? So my goal is to be really advanced, right? My goal is not to stop once I'm like a mid-intermediate level. And so I don't mind if when I'm a middle intermediate learner, if I make mistakes that are typical of middle intermediate learners, right? I'm not too worried about that because the benefit of speaking and expressing myself and honing that skill is so much more valuable than learning a few mistakes and maybe picking up a few bad habits. The key is that if you keep a mindset where you are really determined to continually hone your speaking skills and avoid those habits, I think you'll be fine. The problem comes when you have people that get to a pretty good level and they really just stop trying, right? They're just comfortable. And then they tend to have a lot of bad habits and, grammatical mistakes they make over and over again, but there's no like continual effort to fix them, right? And so I think that's the issue. Okay, back to the chat. What's the next language you want to learn? From Florbella. We'll see. I'm definitely considering going back to Korean at some point because I did start learning Korean and I had a whole series on my YouTube channel called Korean from Scratch. And unfortunately, it was just life circumstances that made it almost impossible for me to continue. And it got to a point where I brought it back once already, and I wanted to put that to the side. So I'd consider coming back to Korean. I'd also consider coming back to Dutch because I already spoke Dutch somewhat fluently in the past. I don't count that anymore. It's hard to say. I love Catalan, and I was learning that once. There are a few of these languages, and even in the past, I was learning Finnish, and I still have a couple of Finnish novels. So yeah, we'll see. I don't plan on learning any new languages for a little while. I want to really get all my current languages up to really solid levels. But yeah, we'll see. Also, perhaps Russian. Again, these are languages that I've invested time in the past. Okay, let's see. So, Quarry-Doors. Now, I think, let's see here. So we have a question. Hi, Robin. How do you feel about the theories that language acquisition is entirely about comprehensible input? I've seen a few different people saying that learners should focus on the basics and then on getting a large enough vocabulary to be able to read and immerse, because that's where language acquisition actually happens. What's your take on that? Is vocabulary building more important than drilling tenses and grammatical rules? Does it depend on whether you're at a particular level, beginner, intermediate, etc.? Should learners only drill grammar after they've begun to notice and understand it? Thanks, as always. Okay, so let's see here. Yeah, this is a tough one. Probably a great topic for a video that I can research a bit. So I think that this is purely my personal feeling, right? So just gonna express what comes to my head. I think when people say that it's only about comprehensible input, I don't know necessarily what was intended, but I feel like people take that a bit too far if they truly start to think that like that's literally it. That's all I need to do. For me personally, and again, this has been my experience working with tons and tons of students, but I also realize that I have a bias there because they're students that I worked with. I think that it is incredibly helpful to really drill in, like whether it's drilling, whatever, but to really get comfortable with those grammatical structures early on. And it can be just basic stuff, right? So if we talk here about is the best thing to just like learn lots of vocabulary and really build that up and then later do grammar. I personally prefer to do it backwards, right? So here's the thing. I feel like when I'm doing things like comprehensible input, I feel like the more comfortable I am with at least the basic syntax, right, and the basic grammatical structures of a language, the more valuable that is for me. Now, I know that like that's still part of why we're doing comprehensible input, but I personally feel like the approach that works best for me is I do like doing some grammar drills, some sentence pattern drills, little things just to get that basic sentence structure really, comfortable. Because like in the case of Japanese, for example, Japanese grammar is so drastically different than English grammar. And so if I am still like completely and totally uncomfortable and shaky with just the basic Japanese grammatical structures, then like if I'm trying to do comprehensible input, and at that level, who knows what that is, so much of my cognitive energy is just going to be going into being completely baffled by that basic syntax. So my personal approach, again, is like I like to, get a basic level of comfort with those very basic, structures and the basic syntax of a language. And I find that after that, it's so much easier to build on things. And again, I also do find that I find that output done in certain ways is really, really helpful. So yeah, I guess the short answer, I'll definitely like to think more about this. I'm worried I'll say something unintentionally that is like, comes out the wrong way. But my journey learning a language is not purely about comprehensible input. Even if that is a big part of it, and even if that may be where the true acquisition happens, but there's more to it. And I think that, like if we take it to the extreme, if literally all you did was comprehensible input, nothing else, you're not going to be able to say anything really, right? Now you may be able to quickly improve your speaking skills after that and stuff, but the point is, at some point, you're still going to have to speak. You're still going to have to practice articulating yourself, creating elegant speech. And so I do think there's a bit more to it overall. So I personally feel like perhaps the idea of comprehensible input gets interpreted in different ways. And I think some people take it to the extreme beyond where it was intended, but that's just my interpretation. All right. Let's see. Back to the chat. Peggy asks, what do you think about dictation as a way to improve listening? I think it's fantastic. I love dictation. Laurie asks, have I ever been to, or do I ever think about attending a polyglot conference or gathering? Yeah, I've been to the polyglot conference in Serbia. It was in Novi Sad in 2014. The last few years, I kind of like just haven't, for a long time, I didn't have the financial resources to attend them. I didn't even have enough money to travel at all for a long time. And then the last few years, I've just been so incredibly focused on trying to get these big projects across the line. So certainly starting next year, these are things I would love to do more of. Let's see. Okay. Back to Patreon. So Sylvain asks, hi, Robin. What are your professional and personal plans for the future? Are you planning to work less and dedicate more to yourself and your passion, as your community is growing fast these last months and definitely won't stop growing? You're planning to go back to your roots in the UK. Do you have in mind staying there or moving back again after some time, since you're used to living here and there, exploring the world? Thank you so much for everything. Don't change the way you are. Prends soin de toi. Te mando un abrazo grande. Happy Sunday. Oh, thanks, Sylvain. Yes, so my personal and professional plans are at some point to definitely devote a lot more time to these projects, right? When I say these projects, I mean making YouTube content. And I want to do a lot more diverse types of content, right? Many of you will know my original true passion for why I began doing YouTube was actually documentary filmmaking and short documentary style filmmaking, telling people stories. I actually was a lot more interested in using documentary film to tell other people's stories in the beginning. So I want to do more things like that. I want to do more science-based videos. I want to also produce more other types of content, like writing my second book. And I also have a few other books I would like to write. I want to spend more time working on Journaly and getting that over time to a sort of feature complete state. I want to do more interviews. I have these really great projects that on my backlog. And I do think that working on all these projects, it just feels right. It feels like it's so much fun. I love it so much. I can't really describe how much I love doing this. And like seeing people in the chat, seeing that people actually care and want to engage with me and listen to what I have to say. It's so overwhelmingly nice, if that makes sense. And right now it's almost painful every time I have to stop working on these projects because I got to go to work, or do something else. And it just feels like I have so much more to offer the language learning community. I also would love to do more like charity work or things like providing internships with Journaly, maybe even, doing like free workshops for people in the language community that want to transition into programming or data science. So like whatever, I feel like there are so many ways that I hopefully could have some level of positive impact that I'm not able to do right now because of time constraints with having a full-time job. So those are my professional plans are in the future to be able to do this full-time. And that's one of the reasons why I so deeply appreciate my Patreon community, because as that grows, that makes that more and more feasible over time. And in terms of living in places, I don't want to necessarily just live here and there, move all around the world personally. Most of my adult life, or in fact, my whole adult life, I just wanted to find a place to call home and build a community and become part of a community. So like, for example, one day I actually, in the distant future, if my YouTube and other content creation career, like writing more books, if Journaly and other language apps, like if I could do these things successfully, then I would love to be able to take bigger risks and maybe open a coffee shop that could also be an educational space for a community that I happen to live in, and where I could do a lot of stuff like supporting really young people, like and doing educational programs for children, or helping kids learn languages at an earlier age, or whatever it might be. So these are all things I want to do in the future. And so that's why I'm working so crazy hard right now to try to make that a reality. And I do hope to find a stable situation in life in terms of location as well. So let's see, back to the chat. Constanzo asks, do you ever get frustrated about forgetting words? You just mentioned the word clumsy and I can't remember its meaning, and I get really angry with myself. I do, it's very human and very natural, I think, to get frustrated with ourselves. It doesn't feel good to forget something, right? Personally, I think over time I become less and less frustrated because it just truly is a natural part of the process, right? And every time I forget, it's an opportunity to relearn the word or refresh it, and deepen my my knowledge of that particular word and how well I understand it and remember it. So I know it's a bit cliche, but it is helpful to think of it like every time you forget a word, it's an opportunity to strengthen the memory that you have of that word. But I know it's easier said than done. I don't personally get too angry with myself, but I know that this happens to a lot of people. Okay, next question is again from Quarry Doors. Let's see. Okay, so what's your take on how many Chinese characters or kanji you should learn early on when learning those languages, and what priority is learning characters over vocab and grammar? Some Mandarin courses I've tried only use pinyin to begin with. I think Chinese primary school education does that as well. And then characters later to go with words already learned, which makes a little sense to me. Sorry, which makes little sense to me. The characters have been amazing memory aids for me. In the opposite extreme, my Chinese character textbook wants me to memorize 3,000 characters with their stroke orders and English keyword each before I start learning any Chinese words at all. I don't think that would have worked for me either. What's the sweet spot? I think the sweet spot is something in between. So I do think that characters are extremely helpful. And I know what you mean when you say that they're a good memory aid. For me, learning kanji with Japanese was so incredibly helpful because it adds like a third dimension to every single word that I learn, right? There's something else that I can associate that word with. And the way that I learned a ton of Japanese kanji in Japanese was mostly through vocabulary acquisition. So I actually did not go through and learn tons of kanji in abstract, right, and just memorize them. I did that a little bit, but I mostly learned them through vocabulary words in the beginning. So I would learn words like fukuzatsu, which means complicated in Japanese. And I didn't actually know what the individual character fuku and the individual character zatsu, I didn't necessarily know what they meant like on their own, but I knew how to read the word fukuzatsu and I knew what that word meant. And then over time, you start to see those same kanji appear in a bunch of different words and you sort of start to build an intuition for what they mean. But to me, that's actually more helpful because at the end of the day, that's how the language exists and that's how those characters are used. You rarely actually in real life need to know specifically like what does that individual character mean outside of the context of a real word. So my perspective is characters are incredibly important, incredibly helpful. I think it's really useful to learn them. And I think that if you can really embrace them and fall in love with learning characters, like Chinese characters in languages that use them, I think it can only do great things for you. And I do think that part of the mistake is learning them really slowly, because when you learn them extremely slowly, like 50 characters every month or like 100 characters a semester, right? So in 3 or 4 months, only 100 characters. The problem is that you don't get that opportunity to see them over and over again. So that's why I learn characters pretty quickly and I teach them to students when I used to teach Japanese. Surprisingly fast, but always in the context of real words. And people are often amazed at how fast they can get a general level of comfort with like 500 or 600 characters. And I find that after that, it starts to get easier because you're going to start seeing them over and over again in real context. So that's that. Let's see. That's the final question from Patreon. At least that's the final one that I can see on the post. I hope I didn't miss anything. Let me just check one more thing here just to make sure I don't leave anybody out. Let's see. Oh, okay. So Linda asks, could you talk more about your interview with Carrie? Did you feel nervous? How did you prepare yourself? Are you satisfied with the outcome? Or do you think you could have done better? So Linda is referencing the interview I did on Easy German in German. So I did an interview in the German language on that channel, and it was fantastic, really good fun. I was really happy, to be honest. I mean, like I lived in Hamburg, right, just for like barely 2 months. But because I lived there, it might give the impression like, oh, okay, so you have loads of experience speaking German. But the reality is I've barely spoken German to people. You know, I studied German by myself living in Portugal before I went to Hamburg. And then once I got to Hamburg, most of my interactions were things like, you know, ich nehme einen Americano, right? Or like, I'll have an Americano, you know, or things like at the grocery store, or like pretty small things. You know, my job was a big focus. I was desperately trying to just get caught up. I was studying public relations and trying to get my skills there. And before I even had a chance to do that, my job was gone because the company went like basically bankrupt. And so, yeah, I didn't actually get to speak a lot of German. I was originally thinking, well, I've got loads of time. I'm going to live here for a long time. I'll have time for that later. So, yeah, after that, I have basically not spoken German with a person. And that was like 5 years ago. I had a brief period in 2018 where I was bringing my German back, and I documented that on the channel. But I didn't have a single German conversation during that period. So all that is to say, I really don't have much experience speaking German with people. And I haven't done it, well, I haven't done it in like 5 years prior to that. So I was really delighted that I was able to go on the Easy German channel. Carrie was a wonderful host for me, and she was very patient, and the whole team was great. The fact that I was able to go on there and get through a real conversation, you know, talking about complex things. I wasn't discussing like, where are you from? How old are you? You know, I was trying to express my complex thoughts on language learning topics in German. And so it wasn't perfect. You know, I had a lot of mistakes, you know, but I genuinely feel happy because when I posted my video speaking German to myself, I was so excited, right? And most people were really positive. But some people were saying, oh, come on, you know, this is not real. I bet if you talk to a person, you would be, you know, you'd see that this isn't, you know, real conversational skills. So I was really delighted to take on that challenge. And I think it proved that things like my podcast interview method, practicing by myself, it can really work, and it really can translate over to real speaking skills. Okay, that's the last question from Patreon. Let me just quickly scroll through the chat. We're just over an hour. I still don't know how long people are happy to watch these, but got some lovely comments in here. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you again, Bailey. Let's see here. Daniel says, hola Robin, ayer compré tu libro. And then there's a lovely message in Spanish. So he bought my book yesterday. I remember seeing your transaction come through. Noel asks, can you make more videos in Japanese? Yeah, I'd love to do more videos in Japanese. I think next year I would like to do a lot more of that. The trouble is that it literally doubles my production time when I have to do the subtitles and things like that. And also, like, to be honest, Japanese, I just haven't been speaking Japanese, so it's a little bit more difficult, but I would love to do that. Andrea says, how would you tackle bad speaking habits when you have a conversational level? I discussed that. This question probably came in before, but yeah, I basically just always try to have an open mind. I always try to keep in mind that as I get more advanced, it's going to get easier and easier to break those habits, as long as I stay open-minded about finding the habits, addressing them, and practicing. Let's see, going through. Kenura asks, what do you think about the mass immersion approach, or AJAT? I have a lot of thoughts on mass immersion and AJAT. I think there's a lot of really helpful stuff in there, but I think a lot of people approach it to an extreme, and it's an extreme approach. The problem that I have with things like AJAT, and at least with the way that people often talk about it and prescribe it, is that it is very, very extreme, or it can be. And I have personally seen a very, very low success rate in terms of people being able to stick with it. That's the problem, right? So I've seen so many people get extremely excited about AJAT. And for those of you who don't know, AJAT is all Japanese all the time. And you know, this idea of mass immersion. And when people take it to the extreme and when they do it very quickly. In my book, I talk about going cold turkey on your native language and how dangerous that can be. A lot of people get so excited and then they actually end up completely crashing and burning. Like they burn themselves out very quickly, and then it can be quite devastating for their motivation. And sometimes they don't even continue. So I have seen very few people relatively really be able to stick to AJAT all the way and keep going with it. And so I've seen it do a lot of damage to people in that regard. I don't think that's necessarily saying it's not valuable. I think it can be extremely powerful. I'm just saying that I think we have to be delicate about how we talk about it and how we prescribe it. Let's see. So we have a ton of questions. I'm a little bit behind. I don't know what to do. We're at 1 hour and 15 minutes. Let's see. Jasmine asks, what do you think about the Busu app? I like it. I've actually been testing it the last month. So Busu reached out to me and asked me if I would test out their application and do a video. So I've been doing that. It's my first time doing that, where a company reaches out to me and says, hey, could you test our app? So I'm still figuring out the best way to be as objective as possible and do a good job of reviewing it, but I'm enjoying it. I do have a lot of thoughts. Someone else asked about Duolingo, if it's a good beginner resource. I think it can be. I have not personally had wonderful experiences with Duolingo. I used it a lot in the older days. I think it's improved quite a bit. I find I have very low retention with Duolingo. That's the thing. But a lot of people like it, and it's very good at helping you build a habit. So I do have complex thoughts about Duolingo. I don't personally use it. I think there are other apps that I prefer at the beginner level, but they also have a lot of languages supported, which is definitely a plus. Scrolling through, Luis asks, have I ever tried the old school Glossika courses? Yeah, I did. I used Glossika for Vietnamese. I used it for Catalan, Finnish. I tried it for a bunch of stuff before they had the new format. And I quite enjoyed that, I have to say. Let's see. Carolina says, when will you post the video about Busu? It should be sometime in hopefully mid-November, mid-December. I think mid to the end of December. I'm about to be, I basically was testing it for a whole month. I'm almost done with that. Rachel says, I know you used to be an interpreter. Does your current job have to do with linguistics? 0. It's really funny. Like my last few jobs, almost nobody even knew that I had these pretty rare language skills. I would talk to people in the office in different languages, and occasionally someone would be like, were you just speaking German? Or not German, but whatever, especially Japanese. But no, my last 3 years of my career, in terms of my full-time job, has had almost 0 to do with languages, unless you consider programming languages. Okay, I think I'm gonna have to probably stop it here, only because I don't know how long people are willing to watch these. There's some wonderful questions in the chat. What I would like to do is, there's just so many good things in here. So what I would love is if you could leave comments on this video. This video is gonna be live on YouTube. Please leave me comments, letting me know how you want me to do these. This is a totally new world for me. I enjoy it so much, and I probably should do some of these that are specifically about engaging with everyone in the chat. It is a bit tricky combining, Patreon and the chat. I want to provide as much value as I can to my Patreon supporters, because it truly, I think my Patreon community, if it can grow, is going to be a big part of what allows me to basically live my dream life, which is doing all this stuff full time. So I want to provide value for them, but I want to also make sure I take care of all of the wonderful people supporting me outside of Patreon as well. So please let me know if you like this format. I'm super open to feedback on how I can improve this. Do you want me to do more of these? Do we want to do one, maybe even once a week in the future, like a study with me? We could study together for an hour. I'm not really sure, but let me know, and I'll continue to explore how we can improve this. So thanks so much, everybody. I'm sending big hugs all over the world to all of you. If you don't like hugs, feel free to reject it. But yeah, so happy Sunday. Have a wonderful week of language learning. And seriously, I love you all. Thank you so much. I can't describe how much my life is changing right now, these last few months, as the community grows. And that's basically all of you guys. So, hasta pronto. Arigatou gozaimasu. I'm not going to go through every language, but see you guys later. Bye.